It's strange to think that there was a time when people were begging for a home console Pokemon game. Generations of consoles went by, the Nintendo 64, the GameCube, the Wii, and while they all had their Pokemon adjacent games like Pokemon Tournament, Pokemon Puzzle League, Pokemon Rumble, if anyone remembers that Wii Shop exclusive, but none that you could call an actual mainline Pokemon game. Pokemon had been relegated to handheld consoles since their inception on the original Game Boy, and they were mainstays of all the handhelds that followed, from the DS through the 3DS and then to the Switch. Now, the Switch is an interesting case because it serves as a dual functioning system, both handheld and home console packed in one. When Pokemon Sword and Shield came out in 2019, and I'm not forgetting about Pokemon Let's Go, but that is a whole other experience. It was the first actual mainline Pokemon game for what could be considered a home console. And for the sake of this video, I'm going to consider it one. Since Sword and Shield, there have been other releases, including Scarlet and Violet and Legends Arceus, but what I purposely left out for the sake of this video, and for the sake of mystery, is that none of those were actually what I would consider to be the original first mainline Pokemon games for a home console. In 2004 and 2005 respectively, the company Genius Sonority, who would go on to publish several Pokemon-related games, released Pokemon Coliseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness for the GameCube. The games share a lot in common with most mainline Pokemon games, from a similar story-driven experience focused on raising a team of Pokemon and battling your way through obstacles. However, the games are also extremely different at their core. There were no random Pokemon encounters in tall grasses, there were no gyms or Elite Four, and there was an entirely new Shadow Pokemon system, which ties the whole thing together. None of the game's new systems ever made their way back into a mainline Pokemon title, except for the Shadow Pokemon system, which now has a nice spot in Pokemon Go. But still, why did Coliseum, and even more so Gale of Darkness, release for a home console and then quickly fade away? I'm sure if you ask an actual Pokemon fan, like someone who has made it a point to play even the most recent Pokemon games, they can recall Coliseum and Gale of Darkness. But ask the layperson or the casual gamer and they might not remember it. The games aren't held up on the same laurels as the other generations of their time, Ruby and Sapphire and the follow-ups Diamond and Pearl. I'm in a weird spot with this though. See, I have been forced to remember Gale of Darkness every day of my life. Now, I know that sounds weird, but when my mom got my brother and I a GameCube, sometime around 2005, she got us the Gale of Darkness Special Edition console. So, to this day, every time I look at my game shelf or my consoles and I go to play a classic game, I am met with the face of the game's legendary Pokemon, Shadow Lugia. Even more so, I still own the game from when I was a kid. And I even have the original game guide, which sits on my bookshelf alongside other guides from the time. So no, I'm not actually forced to remember it, but it has been an integral part of my gaming journey, and it's a game that I remember fondly from my childhood. Which brings me to the question I want to look at today. Why didn't the game stick around in the collective gaming consciousness? What didn't work for the games that they never got any sequel or any sort of modern references aside from the addition of one of their systems in Pokemon Go? A system that I doubt a majority of players realize came from a GameCube game. If you've seen my other videos, you know that I love exploring nostalgia. And if you haven't seen my other videos, well, you can go back and watch them after this. But today, I want to delve back into specifically Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness and explore what works and what doesn't, and maybe come up with some theories for why the game didn't stick around. You know, aside from the fact that it's now on a retro console, and a copy of the game can cost upwards of $200, which, weirdly enough, is more expensive than the limited edition console I got it with. I'll also go into Pokemon Coliseum a little bit because it is important for the lore and it shares some of the same systems as Gale of Darkness, but I'm much more familiar with the latter, and I think in the end it utilizes the new systems better and more fully, and it'll help paint a better picture of why the games didn't stick around, because I do think there is a common reason. So, with that, Welcome back to Victim of Nostalgia, the series where I delve back in time to explore the media that I loved as a kid and see if it actually aged well, or if I'm just blinded by the rose-colored glasses of fond memories. Let's talk about Pokémon, the forgotten GameCube generation. Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness and Pokémon Colosseum take place in the Orre region, a mostly desert region without wild Pokémon. For the most part. I'll get into that later. I always imagined it in my head as being located somewhere between the Johto and Hoenn regions, which is where a majority of the game's Pokémon come from. Instead of playing as a new trainer who's setting out on a mission to take down the gyms and beat the Elite Four, instead you play as a character dedicated to recapturing and purifying Shadow Pokémon. What are Shadow Pokémon, you might ask? Well, in the Orre region, during the events of Pokémon Colosseum, we learn about Team Snag'em and Team Cypher, who began stealing Pokémon and locking off their hearts, creating ruthless Shadow Pokémon. Which, now that I think about it, are basically just Heartless from Kingdom Hearts. Crossover? In Pokémon Colosseum, you play as Wes, a former member of Team Snag'em, who were a gang of thieves whose main goal was to steal Pokémon using special Snag'em machines, allowing them to capture trainers' Pokémon mid-battle. Throughout the game, you learn that Snag'em has been working with Team Cypher, who would take the stolen Pokémon and transform them into Shadow Pokémon. Throughout the game, your goal is to rescue the Pokémon and purify them. I'm also trying not to spoil too much in case you want to go back and play the games, so I'm keeping the lore as broad as possible here, but now that you know what happened in Colosseum, let's talk about the sequel, Gale of Darkness. The game takes place about 5 to 10 years after Colosseum and opens with a ship at sea that's suddenly attacked by mysterious enemies and an even more mysterious Shadow Lugia, who kidnap the entire ship and carry it away. The game's action really kicks off though when the region's Pokemon professor, Professor Crane, gets kidnapped by Team Cypher, whose goal is to make a Shadow Pokemon so strong that it cannot be purified, called XD001. The player, whose default name is Michael, must find Team Cypher, save the professor, and stop them from creating an unstoppable evil. The player is presented with a Snag'em device, once again allowing the player to steal other trainers' Shadow Pokemon for the sake of purifying them. This system is pretty metal, honestly. Instead of just capturing wild Pokemon, you freaking steal them, justifying it with the fact that you're stealing from evil people. So that's it. That's the basics of the games. Right off the bat, it's pretty clear that there's a lot that's different between these games and the mainline Pokemon games. The two games came out in the years between Ruby and Sapphire and Diamond and Pearl, and from an outside perspective, the game seems like it was a method to try and keep fans engaged, while the Pokemon Company worked on what they deemed to be more important things. Like I mentioned earlier, Colosseum and Gale of Darkness weren't developed by the Pokemon Company. They were instead done by Genius Sonority, and based off their release history, it seems like their main goal was making Pokemon spin-off titles, as well as the occasional work on Dragon Quest, and also, they developed the Denpa Men games. Cool. But that comes back to my main questions for my little thesis statement earlier. Although the games are different from their predecessors, and all the games that followed them too, do they still work as Pokemon games? For the most part, I want to say yes. There is a lot to love about these games, but I think there are some pretty clear mitigating factors that keep them from taking their place among Pokemon royalty. So, let's take a closer look at the game's systems. The battle system is largely identical to other Pokemon games, taking into account all type advantages and skills, but there's one huge difference which I haven't mentioned. Almost the entirety of the game's combat is 2v2. Introduced in Generation 3, the double battle system takes a front seat in the GameCube titles, and while the system is only occasionally used in the main series, having it featured in these games is actually a really nice switch up which helps make fights feel more fresh and interesting. It allows for a more thought out approach to the system, with a more defined strategy, rather than something you occasionally just bump into in the other games. On the other hand though, a majority of trainers in the game aren't shoehorned into a certain archetype who specialize in specific types of Pokemon, which can make strategizing ahead of time tougher, but honestly I don't think it's that much of a problem. The types trainers use are much more varied, except in a few certain instances, like this lovely line of Cypher minions who just so happen to be color-coded by their type. But for the most part, trainers types aren't limited to a certain element or aesthetic. Lore-wise, that actually makes a lot of sense for the Orre region too. I mentioned earlier that there aren't any wild Pokemon in the Orre region. Instead, Pokemon are usually shipped in from other regions, hence the abundance of Hoenn and Johto Pokemon. A lab tech points this out near the start of the game as he gives you Pokeballs. They don't directly address the lack of wild Pokemon, but one NPC in Pyrite Town does offer up a throwaway line about how the Orre region is too caustic for wild Pokemon, which honestly raises more questions than answers, but that's really something for a different deep dive. At the time of Gale of Darkness though, there actually are a few places where wild Pokemon can be found, called PokeSpots. They still aren't your typical Pokemon experience though, with fumbling around in tall grass till you get assaulted by a wild creature. Instead, PokeSpots operate by putting treats on little plates, and occasionally you'll be notified that a Pokemon is at the Pokespot, requiring you then to rush to the Pokespot so you can capture it. This allows players to capture non-shadow Pokemon, which boosts the game's Pokemon variety a little bit. Now, along the lines of the games not having the real quote-unquote wild Pokemon experience, the games are also streamlined for a more straightforward experience. Instead of traveling to different routes to make your way around the region, the games operate on an overworld map system with specific locations you can choose to visit. The locations are unlocked as the story progresses, which keeps things more straightforward. Whenever you leave a city or map location, you are then taken to the overworld map, where you select your next destination. In both games, you are then treated to a short cutscene of the player traveling, either on a motorcycle-like vehicle in Colosseum, or on a moped in Gale of Darkness. And there's something so funny about this young child just fucking mopeding his way around the world of Pokemon. I will say, it did make young Andrew want a moped more. I actually like this system. In Pokemon, traveling the different routes can feel tedious after a while until you unlock abilities like Fly, which allow you to fast travel. However, I don't think that it's the best solution to the tedium problem, and I actually think Sword and Shield did a really good job with the addition of wild areas. They give the player a much more open region to explore while also speeding up travel time between big cities. Those games do still have typical Pokemon routes and caves, which have been and always will be the bane of my existence. I know this is besides the point, but Zubat is my all-time least favorite Pokemon, and every time I am forced into a cave in a Pokemon game, I fear for my life that I will be forced to see that damn bat over and over again. But back to what I was saying. Sword and Shield did a really good job making even the routes feel more explorable, but also more manageable until you unlock better ways to travel, and I really appreciate how that's all done. Colosseum and Gale of Darkness felt like a step in the right direction, but also an overstep, and it took time, but I think Sword and Shield were a great step back that they needed. It only took them 15 years to get there. So one final question probably remains. With no routes and a far more limited amount of wild Pokemon, how the hell do you make sure your Pokemon are leveled up enough for battles? The games do a really good job of making sure grinding isn't needed, at least for levels, but since there aren't routes where you can level up and train your Pokemon, trainers are actually the main way of leveling and training. A vast majority of trainers in the world are actually infinitely fightable, meaning you can keep battling the same trainers over and over again. And while I don't hate this idea, it's kind of fun to train and see how quickly you can beat people, it also feels like a part of that overstep, and the idea needed to be dialed back a bit more. In other Pokemon games, you're usually presented with an opportunity to refight trainers later in the game. Typically, they'll have stronger teams, and it really feels like the world has grown at that point. But I think being able to fight against trainers repeatedly does give you, as a player, more opportunity to work on your actual battling skills against a more realish opponent. But having it as the only option isn't the best. Now, I should probably address the elephant in the room. The one system which remains in use today, even if it's just in a mobile game. Shadow Pokemon. The Shadow Pokemon system, while unique and interesting, has some flaws that I'm not a fan of. Basically, in both games, there's a system where the player is able to spot Shadow Pokemon in battle and then capture them, the same as wild Pokemon in other games, and that's all well and good. Plus, the added ability to repeatedly fight trainers means that in most situations, if you fail to catch a Shadow Pokemon or accidentally defeat it, you're able to try again. There's also a fail-safe in place, but we'll talk about him in a little bit. My main problems with Shadow Pokemon is the purification process. The process feels quite tedious, and even once you unlock a more automatic method for purification, it takes away a bit of the fun of truly training a team. So the way it works is shadow Pokemon, instead of having an XP bar, have a shadow bar, which moves backwards, and once it reaches empty, they can be purified. The ways to reduce the shadow bar are keeping the Pokemon in your party and doing battles, using special cologne scents, or eventually, once it's unlocked, leaving them in a purification chamber, which slowly sucks the shadow out of them. The tedium can be felt right off the bat in Gale of Darkness, as soon as you get your first shadow Pokemon, Teddiursa, who I love. Pretty much your first goal after getting Teddiursa is going to Agate Village to use their ancient purification stone, a process which requires going through several battles to reach the stone. The main problem I have here is even if you have done every single possible battle up to this point, without fighting trainers multiple times yet, your Pokemon won't be ready for purification, and it almost sucks the joy right out of you. That horrible feeling when you fought all the way there, only to be told you can't actually do it yet, and you now have to go back and use colognes or keep battling the same trainers repeatedly until they are ready. It really puts a damper on the speed and enjoyment of the story. I feel like in that specific situation, they should have handled the pacing better, so that right as you reach the purification stone and do your final battle, your Pokemon is ready to be purified. It would add to the player's sense of accomplishment, and it would keep the game moving along instead of stopping it in its tracks, especially because you can't progress the game until Teddiursa is purified. Now, that's really only a problem at the start of the game, but you'll notice that Shadow Pokemon can be a little overwhelming too, especially before unlocking the purification chamber. Your team and then your Pokemon storage boxes will quickly begin to fill up with Shadow Pokemon, and at that point you might be thinking, well, how the hell am I supposed to deal with all these? Thankfully for the Pokemon you do keep in your team, they'll purify just fine over time. But then you have the issue of all those other Shadow Pokemon building up in your storage, and by the time you've purified your team, you'll have to switch out to other Pokemon to purify them too. It begins to feel like a chore more than anything else. Finally, there's the Purification Chamber, which is unlocked partway through the game, and this does help to remove the chore feeling, but it has that same feeling of overstepping, where it takes away the joy of training your team from the ground up, as it kind of just automates the purification process, except for the fact that the system is also confusing as hell to understand at first. Basically, there are 9 chambers, and you can put one Shadow Pokemon in each. Then, in each chamber you surround the Shadow Pokemon with purified Pokemon, and over time they suck the shadow out. Based on the types of Pokemon you use, the purification will be faster or slower, and the game basically tells you to just experiment and figure it out. The problem there is that by the time you do figure it out, you probably will have already beaten the game, so my method was just to throw whatever Pokemon I had sitting around in and hope it worked out. There are some absolutely great guides on optimization for the purification process online, but seeing as the games are going on 20 years old, it feels like the system doesn't have much use now, and I'm really not surprised the purification chamber idea didn't show up in Pokemon Go, even though Shadow Pokemon did. Now, remember how a bit ago I mentioned a failsafe for failing to capture Shadow Pokemon? Yeah, back then. Well, I want to talk about something that both Colosseum and Gale of Darkness do really well, and that is the characters and the tone of the game, starting with a man who should need no introduction. Mirror B might be the single greatest Pokemon character of all time, hands down. I love everything about him, from his design to his perfect theme music in both games, literally 0 notes. Mirror B is one of the villains in Colosseum, and he's kinda like a side villain in Gale of Darkness. His main role in Gale of Darkness though is to provide players with a way to catch Shadow Pokemon they might have missed. Basically, whenever you bump into him, or track him down, throughout the game, his team is made up of Ludicolo and Lombres, and he will have one Shadow Pokemon the players missed. Pretty nice, honestly. But what's more important for me is the tone the character sets. He's silly as hell, but he takes himself so seriously, which might be my favorite villain archetype. But it's also a great showcase for the world of these games. they're hyper stylized, over the top, and incredibly unique when compared to other Pokemon games. That isn't to say that the main series Pokemon games don't have their moments, because they absolutely do have shining, silly moments, but what I love about Gale of Darkness and Colosseum is that they're closer in tone to the Pokemon anime and movies. From a nostalgic point of view, this is the Pokemon game I would hope for after watching the anime. Although I had it the other way around, starting with the games before the show, but after watching the show, I hoped for a game with the same kind of humor. Characters like Mirror B and honestly a lot of Team Cypher remind me of the Jesse and James antics from the show, that over-the-top cartoonish villainy that goes way beyond extreme. Like I said though, the main games do have silly moments and sometimes have silly villains, but a lot of them end up feeling bogged down in the serious nature of what they are trying to achieve. Like Team Aqua trying to flood the world, or Team Plasma trying to start a new world order, stripping trainers of their Pokemon. What's really funny is that the more I wrote this script, the more I realized I fundamentally like Sword and Shield as games, even though I used to not think of them as highly. Team Yell, although later proven to not actually be evil, matched the tone of the show in the same way. Just extremely goofy. I want more of that in Pokemon games. Maybe it's time for me to replay Shield now. But back to what I was saying about the characters and also the world. Other than the villainous characters, the NPCs found roaming the towns help make the whole world feel more alive. Or, I guess lived in would be the better term. Instead of the various tutorial-y NPCs you find in other Pokemon games. You know, the ones who like to drop the not-so-subtle hints about what the player should do. And there are definitely some of those in these games. That isn't a total knock against the concept, but they're well balanced out by other NPCs who actually help to provide context and depth to the game. The Orre region as a whole feels more cohesive than other Pokemon regions. I don't know how many people have actually thought about Pokemon world maps, but let me just say a lot of them are pretty nonsensical. You'll go from nice lush greenery to being in a sandstorm in the blink of an eye. Again, it's not actually a problem in the other games, it's just another opportunity where you have to suspend your disbelief. But the Orre region feels like it's all one connected world, most of which is desert, but even with that, you could see how you move from one place to another. From the coastal city of Gadian Port, to the desert oasis that is Fennec City, to the rocky terrain of Pyrite City, and even grassier areas like Agate Village. As you move through the world, you get some of that more natural, gradual change between regions. You don't just leave a sunny forest and end up in a snowstorm on a mountain. I want to give a shout out to the people who designed this world because it was a unique opportunity to have a Pokemon game where the players don't walk from city to city on different routes. And I think that gave them more opportunity to make everything feel more cohesive and connected. And they did a really great job with it. Now, I've talked a lot about the things I love in this game, and some things I think don't work so well, but if I'm being totally honest, looking past the fact that these games are on a console that's now considered retro, which makes me feel so old, and the fact that they've never been ported and in general weren't that popular even in their own time, I think I know why the games didn't stick around like other Pokemon games and the different generations of their time. And that's because at their core, Colosseum and Gale of Darkness lack identity as Pokemon games. Now what does that mean? You just heard me go on and on about the amazing tone of the game and the unique world, but the truth is, when it comes to Pokemon games, there's something more important than those things. And that is the actual Pokemon that are in the game itself. And what Colosseum and Gale of Darkness are missing are any unique and defining Pokemon. When people hear there's a new Pokemon game coming out, there's most likely some excitement about what new Pokemon might be coming out too. And there's an extra level of excitement about what new starters there will be. That's what I think really set the GameCube games behind. They weren't able to capitalize on that excitement or generate any new defining Pokemon to be remembered. When you think of a Pokemon, especially a starter, you often tie them to the generation they came from. For example, Mudkip is my all-time favorite Pokemon, and I can't unassociate it from Gen 3 because that's where it came from. Same with a Pokemon like Oddish. I'll always associate it with Gen 1, or Hoot Hoot from Gen 2. There are no Pokemon that you see and think, ah yes, that's from the Orre region, because there simply are no new Pokemon. I haven't mentioned it till now, but in Pokemon Colosseum, your starter Pokemon are Umbreon and Espeon, and in Gale of Darkness you get an Eevee, which adds more freedom, but still lacks anything new. The GameCube games piggyback off the generations before them, which I think had a negative impact on the game as a whole. Now, there are some games that get away without new Pokemon, games like Mystery Dungeon or the Ranger games, but the important difference there is that those are complete different games with different playstyles. Colosseum and Gale of Darkness, although different, are essentially the same experience as a mainline Pokemon game when it comes to their battle system and parts of the gameplay. The problem the games had was that they didn't do enough to differentiate themselves from other games. They weren't different enough to be remembered for their gameplay, and they didn't introduce new and different Pokemon. I talked about it near the start of the video, but I would consider Colosseum and Gale of Darkness to be the first mainline games for a home console. Not because they were trying to be though, but because they didn't do enough to not be. Pokemon has always come down to a formula. It's the biggest complaint I hear from people whenever a new Pokemon game is coming out. What's the point of buying it? It's just the same game with a different coat of paint. And to a certain extent, I agree. The games are formulaic, but that doesn't make them bad by any means. Colosseum and Gale of Darkness occupy a weird space because they are those different games, the one that players complain about not getting. But they did get them. They did get a different game, one that changes the standard systems to be something new while still holding on to that ounce of familiarity. But they didn't sell. Colosseum sold just over 2.4 million copies, and Gale of Darkness sold even less. Compared to the generations that surround them, that's barely a fraction of the over 70 million copies sold by the third and fourth generations combined. My standards for what makes a mainline Pokemon game are probably looser than others. You don't have to agree with me on that point, but what I really want you to see is that the forgotten GameCube generations tried to be something different, and it had so much potential, but at the end of the day it fell flat because of the fact that they didn't step far enough, which is funny because I even said earlier the games overstepped in certain areas. They just weren't the right steps. I want you to imagine a world for a second where Pokemon Colosseum and Gale of Darkness came out, but they were treated like a new generation, with new Pokemon, new starters, but they also maintained all the new systems as well. Imagine a world where a new Pokemon game comes out, and you catch a Pokemon, and you can say, that one came from the Orre region. Sadly, that isn't the case, and it won't be. But just imagining that world for a moment makes me happy. We've seen Pokemon remakes in the past, though, for mainline games and even re-releases for the original Mystery Dungeon games. But why are we not getting Gale of Darkness or Colosseum remakes? Or even just re-releases? Nintendo has been making its way through console generations with their Switch virtual systems. If we get a Nintendo GameCube pass, my hope is that we see one or both of these games available for a new generation of players to experience. I could go on about this and make a plea, but I don't think I need to. I had a ton of fun replaying these games, experiencing them as an adult. Colosseum and especially Gale of Darkness hold up extremely well all these years later. The games are fun and have enjoyable and unique stories, and they're definitely worth the revisit all these years later. To a certain extent, I even feel a little honored to still own a copy of Gale of Darkness and to have the fond memories from my childhood that I do. But more so than that, I want other people to remember these games. Whether you're someone who played them as a kid, someone who rented them from a Blockbuster, or someone who has heard of them in passing, or even just someone who's just learning about them right now. I want this video to stand as a testament to the forgotten generation of Pokemon games, so that even in 100 years, if YouTube is still around, maybe someone will stumble across this video and maybe learn about a game they didn't know. Or maybe we'll get remakes or re-releases. Only time will tell, I guess. Okay, I'm gonna get off my little pedestal now, but I want to leave you with one final thought. Remember the games you loved as a kid. Think about them often and cherish those memories. Even if you go back and a game isn't as good as you remembered, still hold on to the memories that you had. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video. It was actually meant to be a filler video while working on a bigger project, but it turned into a little more than that. If you like what you saw, feel free to subscribe, comment, like, whatever it is that people do now. If you want to find me live, I stream a few times a week over at Andy Does Things on Twitch. But for now, that's it. Peace out, y'all. I will catch you all on the flip side.